Welcome, everyone. My name is Khatchig Mouradian, and I'm a lecturer at Columbia University, and I am the co-PI of the Armenian Genocide Denial Program, which is part of the Global Institute for Advanced Study here at NYU. My partner in crime is Professor Paul Boghossian, and upon his initiative, we embarked on this project, which aims at studying false beliefs and denial in general, and more specifically, the denial of the Armenian genocide. The project has been ongoing for a few years now, and as part of the deliverables, we have prepared an edited volume, a manuscript, which is currently with a publisher on the Armenian genocide denial in global perspective. That manuscript, we hope, will come out soon, and our tonight's speaker is part of the core team that contributed chapters to that edited volume. We're happy to have him here. I'll say more about him in a little bit. I have a series of acknowledgements and thanks. I'd like to start with our co-sponsor, the Columbia University Armenian Center. We hold these events regularly, almost every semester. And the Armenian Center at Columbia University has been one of the partners over the past several years now. A few quick announcements. We do not have copies of the book available here, the book that we're going to be here about today, but we have posters with QR codes with 30% off, and I encourage you to check that out. We are also filming tonight's event. The footage will be available hopefully by the end of the week on the website of the Global Institute and the YouTube page. A few thanks to the staff and colleagues who made this event possible. We just show up here, right? And everything is ready. I'd like to thank Global Institute Program Administrator Lee Bond, Philosophy Department staff, David Medzorian, and event staff at NYU and NYU Campus Media. One last announcement, we have a reception after the talk. Again, this is part of our traditional post-event receptions every semester. Please join us. So please head in that direction, not in that direction after the talk is over. Just a quick note about format. We will start with a talk by our speaker tonight, after which Paul and I will be coming up here and do a brief discussion around some of the themes and topics that are going to be raised during the talk. And then after that, we will open it up to the audience. That is going to be the bulk of the discussion portion. Let me give a brief overview of the speaker. Dr. Eldad Ben Aharon is a senior researcher at the Peace Research Institute, Frankfurt, and was previously an Irish Research Council postdoctoral fellow in international security at Dublin City University. His research examines the nexus of security, identity, and memory, drawing on insights from securitization theory, foreign policy, analysis, and oral history. During Dr. Ben Aharon's visiting fellowship here at NYU at the Global Institute for Advanced Study, he will finalize his second manuscript, but today's focus is going to be his first book, Israeli-Turkish Relations at the End of the Cold War, The Geopolitics of Denying the Armenian Genocide, which just came out a few months ago in November 2025 from Edinburgh University Press. The book reveals how a complex geopolitical climate prompted the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs to leverage the Armenian issue as a shared concern, thereby deepening ties with Ankara behind the scenes. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Eldad Ben Aharon.
Good evening, everyone. First of all, thank you, Khatchig, for the kind introduction. And thanks for everyone who allow us to have this very special evening. And thanks, of course, to Paul and Khatchig, my hosts. Without further ado, I will get straight to the talk.
A little louder.
Okay. On the 9th of November, 1983, Turgut Özal won Turkey's general elections. 2 days later, he made a phone call to the country head of state, President Erdogan. That call was a routine in protocol. What happened next was not. I want to start there with that phone call, because this book is mostly about what followed. It is about a decade that historians have largely written off as blank. A decade with no formal relations between Israel and Turkey, no official diplomatic ties, and so the assumption goes, nothing of real consequence. This book shows that that assumption is wrong. What actually happened in the 80s, through back-channel meetings, classified telegrams, secret phone calls, and conversation between diplomats who were never meant to be talking to each other, was a construction of strategic partnership. It was a remarkably close one that would shape the Middle East for the next 4 decades. And at the center of that construction was something no one thought to look for: the memory of the Armenian genocide, deployed as a diplomatic instrument. This book is called Israeli-Turkish Relations at the End of the Cold War, the Geopolitics of Denying the Armenian Genocide, and it was published by Edinburgh University Press in November 2025. 10 years of research, more than 300 archival documents, 6 archives across 2 countries, Israel and United States. To be precise about those numbers, what those numbers mean: a substantial volume of files containing thousands of documents relevant to the Israeli-Turkish relations became accessible for the first time during my PhD fieldwork between 2015 and 2019. I walked through all of them. The more than 300 documents cited in this book are those I selected from this large pile of files and body of materials as directly bearing on the argument. This research is built on thousands. Moreover, 30 interviews, each recounting the same events from very different perspectives. The subtitle already tells you something very important. This is not a book about the Armenian genocide itself. It is a book about how the politics of its denial shaped one of the most consequential but least understood bilateral relationships at the end of the Cold War. Before I get to the argument, I want to say something about the historical record. That is a fixed historical fact around which everything else this research turns. The systematic mass killings of 1.5 million Armenians by the Ottoman Empire between 1915 and 1923 was a genocide. An entire community was destroyed. This is an established position of the overwhelming majority of genocide scholars and historians worldwide. Turkey has contested this designation for over a century. More than 30 states have formally recognized the 1915 genocide, but Turkey has not. This talk falls on the week of the 24th of April, on the 111th anniversary of the Armenian genocide. That matters to me, and I hope it matters to this conversation. So let me state the argument directly, and then I will show you how I got there. In January 1979, Israel lost Iran. The Islamic Revolution severed Israel's most important regional relationship overnight. A relationship built over 3 decades, involving deep intelligence cooperation, military access, and strategic partnership with a Muslim-majority country in the heart of the Middle East. And what replaced the Shah was an Islamic republic that openly called for Israel's removal from the region. For the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, it was not just a diplomatic setback. It was experienced as a trauma. The loss of Iran was not just a loss of one ally. It effectively dismantled the alliance network underpinning Israel's periphery doctrine, the strategic logic of building relationships with non-Arab states at the edge of the Arab world to offset the hostility at its center. Iran had been a cornerstone of that doctrine. With it gone, Turkey was the last remaining pillar. The question that followed was immediate, and it operated under the Israeli policymakers themselves to describe as a domino effect, domino scenario. Could Turkey follow Iran's trajectory? Could it drift towards Islamism, exit NATO, and leave Israel without its last non-Arab strategic partner in the region? That fear drove everything. And it pointed Israeli strategists towards an urgent conclusion. Turkey had to be kept close. But Turkey, in the early 80s, was not interested in Israel at all. In fact, the roots of this lies earlier, with Israeli-Turkish relations steadily enduring over the course of the 70s. Turkey's military government, which had taken power in a coup in 1980, was largely indifferent to Israel. The bilateral relationship had effectively collapsed. So the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs needed something Turkey actually wanted. And what Turkey generals wanted so badly, urgently, was international support against the recognition of the Armenian genocide and against a wave of Armenian political violence targeting Turkish diplomats abroad. And that is the core finding of this book. In this evolving crisis, the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs did not stumble into this situation. It deliberately identified the Armenian genocide question as its primary diplomatic lever and used it systematically to rebuild the relationship with Ankara. And Turkey was not indifferent to this initiative, not at all. From 1981 onwards, the military generals and later Turgut Özal also used this framework to restore relations with Israel and to address what they saw as pressing national security concern: the recognition of the Armenian genocide. Genocide memory was not background to this diplomacy. It was its operating currency. And holding the entire structure together was shared Cold War nightmare. The fear that Turkey might leave NATO, might drift towards the Soviet bloc, might become, and as Israeli diplomats use this phrase explicitly, a second Iran. The fear was felt in Jerusalem, in Washington, and in Ankara. The partnership that resulted was not built on shared values or strategic clarity. It was built on shared misperception. To understand how this was possible, one needs to imagine what the world looked like in 1979 and 1980. Three things happened in rapid succession, and together they created the conditions for which everything that followed. First, on the 16th of January 1979, the Shah of Iran fled. Ayatollah Khomeini returned. The Islamic Revolution was complete. Second, on the 12th of September 1980, Turkey's military staged a coup. Economic collapse, civil unrest, political violence, the country was in a free fall. For NATO, this was a nightmare. Turkey was the alliance's southeastern anchor. The possibility that it might destabilize, or worse, leave, was Washington's worst scenario in the Middle East. For Israel, watching carefully, it was also something else, an opportunity. A country in a crisis, desperate for allies, might be willing to reconsider relationships it has previously rejected. Third, on the 2nd of December 1980, Turkey formally downgraded its diplomatic presence in Israel and vice versa. Arab oil states, particularly Saudi Arabia and Libya, had made it a condition of financial support to Turkey. Boycott of Israel. The humiliation for the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs was real. But so was the calculation. If Turkey could be brought back, the rewards will be enormous. The stage was set. Everything that follows in this book, the secret meetings, the back channels, the denial, begins here. Good. All right. Into this context comes Turgut Özal. And I want to spend a moment on him because one of the things this book shows is that individuals matter, even inside large institutional structures with their own logic. Turkey's military junta, which governed from 1980 to 1983, was indifferent to Israel. Not hostile, but indifferent. The generals had larger problems to deal with. They were managing a country in a crisis, and they saw no strategic benefit in rebuilding a relationship with Israel that had so little to offer them. So they thought. But Özal was different. When he won the 1983 election, he became the prime minister and did something the generals have never done. He reached out. He cultivated Israeli contacts through Jewish American organizations, traveling to meet them here in New York. Drawing on his years in the United States, he saw the Jewish community as a potential bridge to Israel and to American political power. Özal believed he understood how that world works and used that understanding to quietly restart the relationship that had stalled. That is why Özal is on the cover of this book. The image is iconic. It captures him exactly as he was, a man of the 80s operating at the intersection of East and West, tradition and modernity. And it underscores something this book insists on, that decade is not a blank, and the individuals who shaped it were not interchangeable. He was not. I will come back to this theme of individual actor later because what happened in Washington with Ronald Reagan is in some ways the mirror image of the Özal story. An individual who wanted to move the system and found that the system had its own momentum. Before I show you some of the empirical evidence, I want to say something about how I came to it and why this particular research was possible for this particular researcher. I was born and raised in Jerusalem, Israel. I'm a native Hebrew speaker. The Israeli State Archives the cables, the classified memos, the internal debates between diplomats are written in Hebrew, and they were written for Hebrew readers. They carry register, nuance, and subtext. What was said in the room? What was meant between the lines? That is what this research records. But I have lived outside Israel for the last 14 years, in the Netherlands. During that time, I gained significant international experience across different European academic cultures. I completed my MA at the University of Amsterdam and my doctorate at the University of London, and have since then worked at 2 Dutch universities, as well as in Ireland, and now in Germany. That distance matters too. It means I can read insider material from the outside. The 30 interviews this research generated come across from all sides. Israeli diplomats and Mossad directors speaking in Hebrew, Jewish American officials who navigated the Congress during this period, 2 Armenian officials, and 2 Turkish diplomats recording the same events from their own perspective. No single national or diaspora voice was treated as an authoritative. The argument is built across all of them. Moreover, I want to be clear about what my positionality does not mean. It does not make me representative of the Israeli government, not the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, or any state institution. I do not speak for them. This research follows empirical evidence, not political alignment, not to Israel, Turkey, the United States, American Jewish organizations, Armenian American grassroots organizations, Turkish Jewish community, or any other party in this story. The archive does not care where you were born, neither does the argument. One of the most important things the archive revealed was the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs' involvement in the denial of the 1915 genocide. The interviews made this even clearer. What I did not expect, however, was the extent of internal conflict within the ministry itself. There were not 1, but 2 camps. One side was the pro-Turkish faction. Alon Liel, Israel charged the affairs in Ankara, stood at its center, alongside figures like Moshe Sasson, Reuven Merchav, Yehuda Milo, who replaced Liel, among others. And for them, every Turkish request was an opportunity. Rebuilding the relationship with Turkey was a priority. And they were prepared to use whatever leverage they had, including the Armenian genocide question, to get there. On the other side, the skeptics, Oded Eran, Binyamin Oron, and Avi Lamdan, among others. They were making a totally different argument. They were not simply urging caution. They were warning that the pro-Turkish faction was promising Turkey something that the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs could not actually deliver. That was cultivating the belief that it had influence over Washington decisions on the Armenian genocide recognition. Influence that, as the archive would show later, it did not actually possess. This internal division is not just an interesting institutional detail. It is central to the argument of the book. It shows that the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs is not a unified actor, but a complex institution shaped by rank, experience, professional background, culture, and geographical influence that informs decision-making. Because the misperception at the heart of this story, Turkey's belief in Israeli and Jewish influence over Washington, was not something Turkey constructed from the outside. It was something woven into the pro-Turkish function across different chapters of the book, because the illusion served their professional interest, and they believe in this position that reflected what is the best for the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs and for Israel. Now, I want to tell you about a moment that changed this book. When I began this research for my PhD project, I was working primarily with Israeli and Jewish American organizational archives. The argument I was building was already substantial, but something was missing. I knew what Jerusalem was doing, and I knew what Ankara wanted. What I didn't fully understand back then was Washington. And then, in 2021, as I began this book project, 2 years after completing my PhD, during the COVID-19 pandemic, which probably no one remembers, I found the American archival material. The CIA files, the FBI records, the Reagan Presidential Library, documents that had not been part of my scholarly conversation on this period, and that, when I read them, completely changed the layering of the argument for this book. Here is what they showed. Ronald Reagan personally recognized the genocide of the Armenians. In 1981, he named it. Armenian American advisors sat inside his inner circle. The Congress moved repeatedly to pass formal recognition of the Armenian genocide. Reagan was not hostile to this idea. And yet, formal congressional recognition never happened. Not once during his presidency. Why? The American archives give us the answer, and that is not an answer that either Turkey or Israel expected. The CIA, the National Security Council, the FBI, Reagan close advisors, and the State Department blocked it. Not because of the Israeli pressure, not because of the Jewish lobby, but on Cold War and NATO grounds. Turkey's strategic value to the Western alliance was simply too great. Washington had already made its calculation independently, before Israel was never in the room. Reagan is, in many ways, the mirror image of Uzal, but moving in the opposite direction. Both men had personal convictions that ran ahead of their institutions. Uzal succeeded in moving Turkey because he understood how to work the system from the inside. Reagan failed to move the US on Armenian genocide recognition because the national security apparatus moved faster and in the other direction. The full picture of how that decision was made and what it revealed about the relationship between individual conviction and institutional momentum is something I trace across 2 chapters of the book, and I cannot do it full justice here. And this is where the argument arrives at its most important point. Turkey, especially after Uzal came into the Prime Minister office in late 1983, was convinced that Israeli and Jewish influence control Washington decisions on the Armenian genocide. This conviction was not peripheral to Turkey's strategy. It was its foundation. The entire strategic partnership that Ankara was building with Jerusalem was built on this belief. And what makes this story so remarkable is that both sides choose to believe in it. The Turkish Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Uzal himself believed in Israeli Jewish power because that belief justified their strategic choices, denying the Armenian genocide. Chapter 6 showed this clearly through the 1987 Armenian Genocide Bill in the European Parliament and shortly thereafter in the US Congress, an especially pivotal moment for both Turkey and the United States. And the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, especially the pro-Turkish function, played along because that belief gave it leverage it could not otherwise claim. But that belief does not hold up to scrutiny. There is, however, one exception to this misperception of Jewish and Israeli power. It appears at the end of chapter 5 in the book, in the case of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. The museum was initiated under the Carter administration in the late 70s and framed around genocide prevention, with the Holocaust as its central normative reference point. When the question arose as to whether the Armenians would receive a permanent place in the exhibition, Israeli diplomats immediately understood the stakes, but sought to follow the established pattern which I already showed. Turkey was convinced that the Israeli and Jewish influence shaped Washington decisions on the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum as well. And the pro-Turkish faction within the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs did the best to ensure that Ankara that they were doing everything possible to block the Armenian initiative. However, in 1987, something shifted. The Armenians were close than ever before to getting the 1915 genocide into the exhibition in the United States Memorial alongside the Holocaust. It meant one thing: a permanent Armenian presence in the most symbolically loaded Jewish institution in America that would carry implications for decades, possibly for generations. As Yitzhak Lior, one of the leading diplomats I interviewed for this book, put it, and I'm quoting from one of the archival memos in last few pages of chapter 5, put it. It was not only a Turkish problem, it was also an Israeli and a Jewish one, an attempt to address a long-term strategic interest embedded into a major institutional and symbolic site at the heart of the United States. Chapter 5 of the book is the one I found myself returning to the most. It is a different kind of case study entirely, and I will leave it here because it deserves to be read rather than be summarized. All in all, the cost beyond that one case was more than 40 years of blocked Armenian genocide recognition in the United States, and delayed recognition among NATO allies, including Germany, the Netherlands, France, among others. A partnership that built on fiction, a historical record that until now remained largely hidden. I want to end by connecting this history to the present because the connections are not abstract. The relationship between Israel and Turkey today is crumbling. From the Mavi Marmara in 2010, which ruptured the very relationship of that this book analyzes, to the current tensions over Syria, Iran, Gaza, and the two countries that were quietly drawing closer in the 80s now find themselves at times in open confrontation. To understand this turbulence, one must first understand what was built in the decade this book illuminates. The partnership that emerged was not grounded in shared values or strategic clarity, but in a mutual misperception. And more broadly, this book is a case study in how alliances are actually constructed. not in grand ceremonies or formal treaties, but in back-channel telegrams, in secret meetings in New York hotel rooms, in personal relationship between diplomats whose names never appear in the history books. And what I hope this research shows, perhaps most of all, is the power of the interplay between security, foreign policy, and the international politics of memory. The 1980s partnership between Israel and Turkey was not just a geopolitical arrangement. It was a negotiation over historical memory, over those whose trauma counted, whose genocide could be acknowledged, and whose recognition could be traded. Individual diplomats made choices that shaped that negotiation, and institutions carried these choices forward for decades. I want to end where I started. On the 9th of November, 1983, Uzal picks up the phone. A decade of secret diplomacy begins. A genocide continues to be denied. History is made, but by what is denied? The misperception that held this partnership together has now dissolved, exposed by archives, by the interviews, by the documents that were never meant to be read by anyone outside the room they were written. And that raises a question I want to leave with you, and hope we will drive the conversation we are about to have. What does it mean when alliance outlasts the fiction that carried it? Thank you very much.
That was a really interesting talk. Thank you very much. Maybe I could start by asking about something that's just an assumption of your book, for which there is a lot of evidence, which is that the denial of the Armenian genocide was a very high priority for the Republic of Turkey. And something that people who are not that versed in this issue find puzzling is, how could this be? This was 111 years ago. The political entity that carried this out, the Ottoman Empire, no longer exists. Why is the current Republic of Turkey so invested in denying that this thing, which everybody in the world knows happened? What is the significance of this?
Yes, it's puzzling. At the same time, one wonders, how is it still possible? From what I came across, especially reading quite a lot of scholarly literature on denying the Armenian genocide, I learned how embedded the denial into the education system in Turkey. So children already from secondary school, even primary school, are being taught about the Armenian question. So it's framed as a question, not as a genocide. And when children already come across the denial so early, it's easier, I think, to develop a new generation of denial. So it's easier to maintain the denial and create a civil code around it. And this is one layer of denial. And then comes the second layer in the 80s, where Turkey was really invested in creating a machinery of denial, institutions that were established back in that time, even here in the United States, to deny the Armenian genocide and create public awareness to the question of the genocide. That's another layer. This is where the book actually comes in and framed this whole period around the international politics of memory, which I just mentioned. So I think these two levels are very important. And I also think that these days, because so many Turkish journalists, activists, human rights, even scholars, right, we know them, recognize the genocide, it is harder for Turkey to deny the genocide like it was back then, back in the 80s. So it's a different period, so to speak, especially after the centenary of the Armenian genocide in 2015. But it's still, we know that.
No, that's for sure. But I was wondering about motive. That is, did you gain insight into why this? No one who carried out the genocide is alive today. The political entity that carried it out is not around today. Why is the current government so invested? Is it fear of reparations? Is it fear of moral undermining? What exactly is the motive? That's what I was wondering about.
My impression is that it's all of the above. So it's the fear of being accused that something's so horrible. So the crime of all crimes, right? Being accused of genocide. Of course, reparations to the Armenians. There's so much also work now being done about how much property and businesses and wealth was stolen from the Armenians during the period of the genocide and even later. So there's so many questions here beyond the formal acknowledgement of the crime against the Armenians that is labeled as genocide. I think the whole questions of reparations and we have also the Luxembourg Agreement from 1952 of the Israeli-West Germany agreement, which is sort of the role model, right, for this type of reparations. And I think that Turkey fears from the possibility of being imposed into such an agreement, and even also compensating for land and so on. So it's a question of national security for Turkey.
Eldad, thank you for this talk. You are making with this work an intervention at different levels, right? And challenging in the process and challenging a number of assumptions. The scholarship on Israel, Turkey, and the denial of the Armenian genocide, and this is where the significance of your work in part lies, right? Has not tackled much of this. One aspect that has been addressed, tackled, explored by more than one scholar is the dynamic of the complicated relationship between the Jewish community in Turkey, Jewish American organizations in the United States, and Israel. Can you help situate that also within the framework that you're using here, and tell us what are some of the dynamics you discovered in your work?
Sure. So, indeed, the Turkish Jews, and specifically 3 individuals, they were sort of representing Turkey in the process of denying the Armenian genocide and negotiating the recognition and denial during the 80s. And as you mentioned, there are two other books about this issue, about specifically addressing the question of the Turkish Jewish community. So as the argument goes, they were also part of making or showing the Turks a huge effort just to show them alignment with the story they were telling about the Armenian question. And they were also taught not to mention the word genocide and negotiate the denial wherever they can. But I came across a number of times reading in the memos of the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs how they were also trying to show the Turkish government, and Uzal especially, that they were aligning with the story, They were doing everything possible to protect Turkey's reputation in the United States, especially, only to show that they are loyal citizens of Turkey and not aligning with the Armenians or Armenian community here in the United States or elsewhere. And it's actually a very interesting perspective of the story behind this misperception. And it doesn't mean that they were not sometimes making an effort that was significant. But at the end of the day, when we see the Reagan administration and the substantial archival material that shows that he was in favor of recognition, but his administration was blocking it, it did not wait so much in the process.
And sort of a follow-up to the question, you are revealing here how there is this kind of game that's being played, this notion that everybody's thinking that the Israelis are engaged in this campaign in Turkey. The Turkish perspective is this is happening, this is effective, and so on. But it also seems to me that outside of these actors, other key actors are also have bought into the narrative. And one example I would say would be Armenian American activists, right? So let's in the 90s, in the 2000s, around 2005, 6, 7, you have a major, activist movement by Armenian American organizations against ADL for its role in, pushing for the United States not acknowledging the genocide. So the narrative is something that is not just bought by, the Turkish establishment, the Turkish foreign policy establishment, and so on and so forth. It is also very much bought by, circles in the United States. I would even say perhaps the media, and most certainly the Armenian American activist organizations. What's your insight on this?
So I was briefly referring to it in my presentation. I believe that the most significant part of what you mentioned refers to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, which was very significant for both Jews and ADL and the Armenians. And we can see it, through the chapter, when you will read it, then you see the competition between the Armenian American organizations and the Jewish organizations, as well the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So at the end of the chapter, it's really it's a race. It's a race who will be in and who will be out. And this is a very important period for the establishment of the museum, because from 1987, the project started to gradually be completed. So we see how in the early 80s or the late 70s, we see how the idea, it's only an idea, it's only a seminal idea, and Carter is establishing this committee that will examine the idea of American Holocaust Museum, and there are no roots to the project. And then in 1987, 88, we see how this project goes further. And when the Armenians secure their spot in the exhibition, then it becomes really a game where the Jewish organizations, ADL as well, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs were really pressing on leaving them out, leaving the Armenian genocide out of the memorial. So I think that this tension was built specifically through this project. And it's a lot. Until this very day, it's all about the Holocaust. There is a mention, of course, on genocide prevention, the scale of preventing the future genocides, but the Armenian genocide is hardly being mentioned.
So you have this very resonant phrase, history is made by what is denied. Could be read in many different ways, I guess, right. But it seems to me that there is a very good illustration of this in the war between Azerbaijan and Armenia, recent war, that resulted in the cleansing of the historic part of Azerbaijan, Nagorno-Karabakh, historic part of Armenia. And many analysts believe that the crucial factors in the victory that Azerbaijan had over Armenia was the help of both Turkey and Israel. So a very interesting little nexus here for the actors in your book. How do you see the relation between the issue that you're discussing and this current continuation of the genocide in this chapter?
Well, that's a very important framing. I'm touching upon it in my epilogue. So the epilogue of the book goes deeper into how the decade of the 80s, the formative years, I call them, of the 80s, where the genocide started to be denied, and how it continues prolonged into the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, which is being or re-ruptured in 1988 into the establishment of both Azerbaijan and Republic of Armenia. And definitely I can see how Azerbaijan is a sort of the replacing pillar of Iran. So Iran is out, as I mentioned at the beginning, after the 1979 Islamic Revolution, and Azerbaijan sort of replacing Azerbaijan. Yeah, Azerbaijan is also sort of replacing Iran in terms of how this strategic partnership looks like. So another Muslim majority country, secular, authoritarian, that's easier to work with authoritarian leaders.
Oil producing.
Yes. Israel is a key player in the region, definitely, and this is again a trade-off. Israel gets the access to the border, to the close border between Iran and Azerbaijan, and Azerbaijan provide Israel oil, energy supply, everything. So it's a trade-off. It's a clear trade-off, and I can definitely see how how Azerbaijan replaced Iran in the model of the periphery doctrine 2.0.
Let's open it up to questions
Sure.
from the audience.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the talk. Very interesting and engaging material. My question is more about details about how Washington works and the Reagan administration, and perhaps your response will be, well, I should just read the book, maybe. But I did want to home in on a few details. One is, I believe in 1983 or 84, Congress did pass a resolution on the Armenian genocide. And from what I speculate, it has to do with maybe the 10-year anniversary of the invasion of Cyprus. I think there was some other dynamic going on there, and I don't know what that tells us about the White House versus Congress. Reagan mentions the Armenian genocide, as you note, in a speech about remembering the Holocaust, but never again, never before. I don't think he issues April 24th statements either. So I'm just wondering, how come that, what was the exception, and how did that happen? And finally, a third question that occurred to me as you were speaking. I understand the US foreign policy position vis-a-vis Turkey during the Cold War, but what happens after the end of the Cold War? Why did this path dependency get maintained in Washington, especially as you argue there was no real influence from either the Israeli or the Turkish side? Thank you.
Sure. So I will try to answer all of your three questions. So first of all, you refer to the Armenian Genocide Bill in 1985. Yes, there were two bills, one in 1975 and one in 85. And from 1987 onwards, the bill was introduced almost every year. So you refer to the Armenian Genocide Bill in 1985, which was rejected. It was rejected, but it reduced. And by introducing the initiative of recognizing the Armenian genocide, it's already very alarming for, if we try to imagine the people back then. Following up on your second question, so about Reagan mentioning the Armenian genocide. So first of all, he said the genocide of the Armenians, as he was referring to other genocides as well, the Cambodians and so on. So it's a bit of odd phrasing. He didn't refer to it as the 1915 genocide or the Armenian genocide. He referred to it as genocide of the Armenians. But actually putting together this sentence and mentioning genocide with Armenians was shocking to many people. And I think what he was trying to do is basically aligning with Carter's idea of genocide prevention and talking about the idea of establishing a museum in the United States that will refer to the Holocaust as its main case study, and then referring to other case studies as well. Armenians was obviously one of them. With regards to the continuity of the 90s and so on, so this is what the book is arguing, that the formative years of the 80s were actually, so this framing of not recognizing the genocide and making Turkey so important and please Turkey was something that was going on almost until Erdogan came into power. So throughout the whole 90s, Turkey was also very important to NATO. Even if NATO, in the Cold War end, Turkey-American relations were in great framing during the 90s. So nobody wants to, so this is the next layering of the argument, nobody wants to upset Turkey. So upsetting Turkey was not part of the deal. So during bad times, like the 80s and late 70s, nobody wants Turkey to be drifted out of NATO. And then nobody wants to upset Turkey in good times. So nobody touched that hot potato anymore. So this closet was closed for almost 4 decades. And then the Congress passed the recognition in 2019 for the first time.
Thank you.
Sure.
Yes, okay. I don't think we need the microphone.
Just for the
First of all, thanks for the fantastic book. Yeah, so I have 3 quick questions. You alluded to it, what's happening in the 90s and how the relations take on a new face with the military deals and a genuine feeling of closeness. So my question would be, how did these diplomats get it so wrong in the late 90s and put all their credit, all their money on the postmodern coup and the military generals? Of course, as you know, I lived there during these years. So it was astonishing how they really didn't believe that Erdogan would come to power. It took them years for them to grasp on that. And even around 2008-9, they started giving up on that idea that that's just gonna pass. So how did they get it so wrong? And at the same time, how do the politics of recognition of Armenian genocide, even not officially in Israel, right? In Hebrew, you say HaShoah Armeni, use the exact same word for, you have Shoah and you have Shoah Armeni, which is the Armenian genocide. And between merits and recognizing it, so at the moment when Turkey and Israel are coming closest together is when the same parties that are supporting relations with Turkey actually recognize the Armenian genocide and integrate it into the education system at the same time. So I would like to hear how they are able to deny it in the US, but not deny it in the school systems in Israel where they're studying it. They're studying the Armenian genocide at times. And then the last question would be, what role did the denial of the Armenian genocide play in the denial of Nakba also, 1948, and almost a model of how to implement denial is recreated and almost in the same time periods. You were talking about usually only 60, 70 years later is when denial sets in. So what were did this play a model, or has it played a model? Of course, with current events in Gaza, that's something different, that's fresh, but I'm talking over the period of time. Thanks.
That's great, thank you. So I think, as I showed in the presentation, and the book is also showing it very clearly, not everyone was in favor of helping Turkey. Some of the diplomats I interviewed and also mentioned here in the talk were totally against the idea, because they thought they really could not deliver this pressure and also making or forcing policymakers in the United States to recognize or not recognize the Armenian genocide. So, as I mentioned, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is not a unified actor, and therefore, there were some diplomats who were definitely against this so-called helping Turkey to deny genocide. And this is another layer that I mentioned in the book as well, that these are second-generation Holocaust diplomats who, some of them lost their family in the Holocaust. Some of them were survivors of the Holocaust, and they also, in internal memos, they mention it to each other. How can we, as our parents survived the Holocaust, could help Turkey do something like that? Where is our moral duty in this case? And one of them mentioning that he hopes that no one will find these documents ever. And these were extremely classified documents. So the one I retrieved from the archive were classified as top rank classified documents. About your second question, so there is this context of denying is also through memory legislation. So we see this very strong momentum here in Europe also, that lots of European countries legislating memory laws about the past. So it introduces the language or the grammar that people can remember what happened in the past. And Israel is doing it as well. So the last 20 years or so, there are so many memory laws passing through the Knesset. And one of them is also, so it's introducing a bill about the Armenian genocide, never passing it, but also introducing the Nakba law. So it's in 2009 that institutions that will recognize the Nakba or commemorate the Nakba will have to be denied for financial support from the government. So this, and I want to introduce this idea of memory laws because they are very common these days and also very powerful instruments in this game of remembering, forgetting, denying. It's very important, and I'm working about this now in my second book. So that's one of the chapters actually dealing with this important framework. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your talk. I remember you also mentioned that denial of the Armenian genocide in Turkey has a long history. It started with the genocide, and like one of the big, like well-known in diplomatic pressure linked to the denial of the Armenian genocide is the cancellation of the movie project 40 Days of Musada in the 1930s. I also vaguely remember that Turkey, learning at school, that Turkey was one of the first countries in the Middle East to recognize Israel in March 1949. So I was wondering what happened between 1949 and 1980s and what changed in the 1980s regarding because it should like date from before, because the Armenians started advocating for the recognition of the genocide well before the 1980s. So Israel had like some role in the denial before that too. Mm-hmm.
So this is a good focus that goes a little bit, of course, beyond the scope of the book, because the book focuses on the late 70s and from 1978 till 1988. So in those years, these early decades of recognition between Israel and Turkey, there's hardly any Armenian genocide debate at all, not just between Israel and Turkey, but also worldwide. So I think only in 1965, in the 50th anniversary of the Armenian genocide, there is some kind of, or there is an emerging project of how to commemorate the Armenian genocide globally and how to think about or how to start a campaign that forces Turkey to recognize the genocide. But as we know also from the literature in Armenian studies, I think that the Cold War and the fact that Armenians were spread around the world throughout so many diasporas, and it's not the world that we have today, right? It's not, there is no social media, so we have the Iron Wall. It was quite challenging for the Armenians to come together and really create a coherent narrative and strong demand for genocide recognition, and they were able to do in the late 70s and 80s, which this is where we see the campaign starting and kicking very, very strongly, and this is where we see how Turkey had to respond to the accusations of genocide and also create its counter-narrative of denial and framing it as question, the Armenian question.
I can ask two questions. Thank you. First of all, thank you so much for this very interesting discussion. Could you, as you say, you focused on a certain period, which you dealt with wonderfully. The previous questioner asked you about the background. I'm going to ask you again to go forward now to the present. So that's to say, since Erdogan and his neo-Ottomanism, Israeli-Turkish relations, to say they plummet is an understatement. They're really enemies in almost at the edge of conflict at time. And Israel has realigned itself with Greece and with the Greek government-oriented government in Cyprus and so on. So where do the issues that you discussed, what do they look like now in this Erdogan period? That's the first question I have. Perhaps I should let you, that's my larger question. So, okay, so I'll ask my second question also, which is that in understanding the situation of the Turkish Jewish community, it's perhaps important to take note the fact that in the interwar period, there was the Turkish government systematically exploited the various minorities, including the Jewish minority in Turkey. Some of them were imprisoned, they took their property, because Turkey was experiencing severe economic problems. And, well, I know people whose families lost all their property and whose grandparents ended up in prison, grandfathers and so on, in Turkey, including a colleague here at NYU whose family had that experience. So does that contextualize, I mean, the Turkish Jewish community is one that in some sense feels itself to be barely tolerated as is, and everyone there remembers the persecution they suffered in the 1930s there, though it's not a widely discussed thing because there's a relatively small community in terms of numbers, but it was very real to them, and I wonder to what extent that explains their present hesitation about offending the Turkish government in any way.
Sure. So let's start with the first question. Well, actually, it's the focus of my second book, which I'm working on now. So looking at this very specific question from the last 25 years. So Turkey is not so important anymore as it used to be in the 1980s to the 1990s to Israel, for several reasons. Israel developed some different alternatives. We just talked about Azerbaijan. But there are other alternatives as well. So it's Cyprus, it's Greece, it's the Abraham Accords, of course, and the peace agreements with Jordan and Egypt, which materialize way more substantially than in the 80s and 90s. And so also the international recognition of the Armenian genocide has gone significantly up since 2015. We see it almost as a norm. So quite a lot of countries in the EU recognize the genocide. The American Congress recognized the genocide. Biden recognized the genocide. And you know what happened to the relations with Turkey? Nothing. So the numbers in the trading between United States and Turkey went up to the highest of ever in the year after Joe Biden recognized the genocide. So the threat of leaving NATO or the idea of bad relations with Turkey is no longer a threat to anyone. And this is actually really puzzling. So why Israel still continue not to recognize the Armenian genocide? So there is a question that goes beyond Turkey. And I'm dealing with it in the second book. And it has to do also with my earlier response about memory legislation. So it's creating this landscape of memory where some memories are above others, so this kind of hierarchy of memory, so Jewish hierarchy and Holocaust above all, and then all the rest goes to the bottom, and this is how you build this social hierarchy as well. And I will leave it here because I want you to read the book when it comes out. And to your second question, yes, it is a good point about thinking about these Turkish Jews and what they've been through, and they're being loyal to the Turkish government, and they still also now are a little bit, they don't know where to position themselves if we're talking about positioning. On the one hand, they are being considered as Zionist and connected to Israel and to the Jewish world. At the same time, they are Turkish citizens. So they try, I think, to be on low profile all the time and not do anything that upsets anyone.
Yeah, I would just add that, as I'm sure you know, that some of the prominent people in the Turkish Jewish community who were most anti-Zionist in the 1930s and fierce Turkish nationalists, that didn't save them when the Turks came after them. And some of those, for example, were imprisoned and lost all their property and so on.
Yes, indeed.
Thank you for your talk. My first question is, you briefly mentioned it, but if you could expand on Israeli-Turkish cooperation against Armenian militants in the Middle East. To what extent did that happen materially? Like, did Turkey request Israel help us fight Asala? What about and that relationship's connection to the PLO and other stuff? I don't know if you could expand on how that fit into this story. Second question, I guess, is what do you think about Azerbaijan kind of somehow building off of the Turkish-Israeli relationship? Sometimes Azerbaijan participates in Armenian genocide denial. It also, interestingly, has a weird relationship with this Jewish population where it says we are very tolerant, Armenians are intolerant, etc. I don't know if you could reflect on Azerbaijan and the Armenian genocide as well.
Okay, let's start from the first question. So I mentioned it briefly in my presentation. So there is this whole idea of political violence is an entry point and a leverage point for the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs to identify what Turkey's military junta wanted, what they framed as their most urgent problem, besides the social and economic chaos in Turkey back then. And then they identified, the Israeli Minister of Foreign Affairs identified this specific need, and they used it just directly. And it's not Turkey, actually, that started this initiative, it was Israel. Ministry of Foreign Affairs that used some of the intelligence they could share with Turkey and try to call Turkey about this topic, because that was the only lever they had back then. And the framing of the whole narrative was about cooperation between Armenian and Palestinian terrorists, which Turkey did not buy at the beginning, which Turkey was not really convinced. And as I mentioned, the Turkish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as well as the junta, were quite indifferent to those initiatives at the beginning. But as the book develops and as the chapters prolong, then we see how the Turkish Ministry of Foreign Affairs is quite convinced that this is it could work well for them, and they even more convinced after so there is a period of the 1982 Lebanon War, the first Lebanon War, where Israel did an effort to show Turkey that they could actually generate some Armenian political violence files. You mentioned Asala, and they retrieve them and hand them over to Turkey. And this is where we see how this gesture produced an open ear on the Turkish side. Now you mentioned something about Azerbaijan, and this is a very interesting point because I think Azerbaijan is very busy with, we call it in public diplomacy, which is part of international relations scholarship, we call it nation branding. So Azerbaijan is very busy with this nation branding of trying to project this image of being tolerant to minorities, specifically to Jews. And this is something that if you look at their Twitter, for example, the social media, they try to frame it as one of the most important achievements that they have as an open country, as a civilized country, as open to the West. It's partly also about being tolerant to Jews for ages, for centuries.
Yeah, and there was an interesting episode I found on social media. Sorry, I'll say it very quickly. Basically, the Palestinian embassy in Azerbaijan was faced with a blogger who was saying that, talking about this militant cooperation from the 80s, and so this blogger is speaking about this on social media, and then the embassy of Palestine in Azerbaijan had to officially deny it and say there was no such thing. And even, I don't remember the rest, but it's somehow that public diplomacy forced escalation on the other side.
Yes, nation branding. This is really a hot topic right now. Thank you.
Time for one last question.
Okay. So, shall I shout? No, thank you very much. As came up just recently, and also in Paul's remarks earlier, at the very beginning, it's really Azerbaijan that really primarily made life intolerable for Armenians. And I think that Israel had nothing to do with it. On the contrary, I think, as Paul will agree, many Armenian families found refuge in Israel. Is that not true?
Some Armenian families found refuge in Israel after the 1915 genocide, but with Azerbaijan is a much more recent thing. It's just 2 years ago, and in that ethnic cleansing, Israel played a big role.
Sorry. Oh no, I shouldn't be holding this. Can you hold it?
Yeah.
You're going to lead it more than me.
So I think you refer to something important, but as Paul mentioned, it predates the establishment of Israel as a nation state in 1948. So these families and these communities that are well established in Haifa and in East Jerusalem, they became part of Israel after 1948 and after 1967. But, and there is a but here, they are not treated as equal citizens. Not all of them, at least. And it has to do more with so how we see the timeline of the genocide, of the Armenian genocide in 1915, 1923, and how Armenians were spread around the Middle East and elsewhere in the world after the genocide. And then we have Israel was created in 1948, and then the 1967 Six-Day War. So not all the Armenians found refuge immediately in Israel. So there is a period of quite substantial years that it was the British mandate, the Turkish, the collapsing Ottoman Empire. So it's a bit flattened the history, I think. But yeah, this is what it was.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eldad. Thank you, everyone, for being here.
Thank you.
So the reception is in the back. Please join us.